Hello everybody, and welcome to our first and probably only episode of What Does This Mean? Today's episode is brought to you by Philippians 2:12 through 13, which says, "Therefore, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who is at work in you to both will and act according to God's purposes." If you were raised in a good Protestant evangelical household, you were raised on a healthy dose of solo gratia, which is a fancy way of saying only grace. Our tradition has long held that it is only by grace that we are saved, and in fact it is the Apostle Paul who taught us this, saying as much about 5 or 6 times in his letters. It is by grace you are saved, and not by works, so that no one can boast. And yet here in one of Paul's letters, one of Paul's favored letters, we have the command to work out our salvation. Well, if we are only saved by grace, then why should we have to work? Especially work with fear and trembling, which are 2 Old Testament words that somehow snuck their way into the New Testament. We should not only work, but we should work with a healthy sense of fear and respect for the work that we must do. And so what does this mean? As good Protestant evangelicals, should we erase verse 12 from our Bibles and forget that it's there and move on? Well, in order to answer this question, we will first look at the first word of Philippians 2:12, therefore, and ask ourselves the wonderful question, what is it therefore? And then we will turn to the Wesleyan tradition to expound upon what it means. So first of all, when we say therefore, we have to look back and look at what connects what came before with this verse. And in the case of Philippians 2, the therefore refers back to the great Christ hymn in Philippians 2:4 through 11, where Paul practically sings a song about the great U-shaped life of Christ and encourages us to have this same attitude and lifestyle. Paul says that even though Jesus was in very nature God, he did not consider equality with God something to grasp, but he emptied himself, taking the form of a servant, humbled himself to death, even death on a cross. And only because he did that did God exalt him to the highest place and gave him the name above every name, that at that name every knee will bow and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. This is what Jesus has done for you. This is the work that Christ has done for you. Therefore, when Paul says, therefore, in Philippians 2:12, he is encouraging his disciples to look back to the U-shaped life of Christ and continue to work with Christ and join Christ in the work that Christ has done on the cross and in the resurrection and the ascension. So therefore, when we work out our salvation, we are working out what God has worked in us by his attitude and his lifestyle. To further extrapolate on this, we now turn to the 18th century Anglican priest John Wesley, who is the grandfather of the Nazarene tradition. He has a phrase that he loved to use called the means of grace. The means of grace are spiritual disciplines, and yet as Wesleyans, we really don't like the word discipline. We understand that we must discipline ourselves and live disciplined lives. We get that. And yet at the same time, when we call the means of grace spiritual disciplines, we make it sound like somehow these are things that we are accomplishing, that somehow we are disciplining ourselves, that we are sort of grunting our way to God's favor, that God doesn't like us, but if we'll pray and read our Bibles, then somehow God will like us. That we don't like that connotation of the word discipline. Instead, we like to call them the means of grace, because in the very words of John Wesley, in one of his many sermons on the means of grace, he defines them as outward signs, words, or actions ordained of God and appointed for this end, and I might say this end only, to be the ordinary channels whereby God might convey to people preventing, justifying, or sanctifying grace. The means of grace are not works that we accomplish. They are things we do that open up the gates of heaven and allow more of God's grace to pour into our lives. The grace that is pouring into us is not our own work, and it's not our own product as if we made it or deserved it. Instead, the grace is poured through the pipes that we are keeping clean so we can receive as much of that grace as possible. And so when we say, work out your salvation with fear and trembling, what we are saying is keep the pipes between you and heaven clean. Keep doing those outward signs, words, or actions that are ordained of God, so that God may pour grace into your life. With that said, John Wesley also says this of the means of grace. He warns us that in the process of time, when the love of many waxed cold, some began to mistake the means for the end, and to place religion rather in doing those outward works than in a heart renewed after the image of God. They forgot that the end of every commandment is love, out of a pure heart, with faith unfeigned, the loving the Lord their God with all their heart, their neighbor as themselves, and the being purified from pride, anger, and evil desire by a faith of the operation of God. What John Wesley is saying there in so many words is that there comes a time in any Christian's life when their love waxes cold and they begin doing the means of grace as if they were spiritual disciplines, as if they were sort of earning their way towards God. And they forgot that the whole reason we do the means of grace is because of love, with faith unfeigned, a way of saying with real faith, not fake faith, to love the Lord our God and our neighbor as ourselves. That the means of grace are merely means by which God makes us more loving and compassionate people. To illustrate what John Wesley meant by this, one of my seminary professors put together a very helpful diagram that shows the circles that every Christian must walk in order to accomplish the working out of the salvation that God is working in them. Once again, this is a fabrication of the 21st century, and yet this diagram is a very helpful way of understanding what John Wesley's thoughts were about how a Christian can work out their salvation. And so the goal is concentric circles, and the first circle is the church. John Wesley loved the church. To be a Wesleyan Christian means that we must love the church and pledge our allegiance to it. John Wesley believed something along the lines of, if arguing about whether somebody is a Christian who doesn't go to church is arguing about whether a fish is still a fish if it's not in water. We could argue all day long about whether that fish was still genetically a fish, but unless somebody puts that fish back in water, it will die. The same is true for Christians. We can argue all day long about whether you're still a Christian if you don't go to church, but unless you get back in the church, you will spiritually die. And for John Wesley, the church was a place where some key important things happened. The first two being just worship and service. These were common in his day and have been common throughout Christian history and were very well understood in Wesley's day. The Sunday morning worship of the church, and then the service to the poor and clothing the naked and all of that, feeding the hungry after that. But John Wesley really helped re-identify a third pillar of what it means to be the church, and that pillar is accountability. John Wesley brought back into his church and back into his groups that he established this idea that church should not just be the place where we worship God and make each other feel good and then go out to serve others. That church should also be the place where a big burly guy approaches you right as you're walking in the door and kind of scares you a little bit and says, "Did you love someone this week? Did you pray this week?" Church should be the place, to John Wesley, where we don't make each other feel comfortable, we make each other feel uncomfortable, and we hold each other accountable to working out our salvation. And it is only after you have committed yourself to a local church that then you can be enabled through the accountability and discipleship to do works of piety like prayer and fasting and searching the scriptures, taking communion, and getting along with Christian friends. To John Wesley, these works of piety are incredibly important, and John Wesley is called a pietist because he lived his life doing these things, and that almost constantly. John Wesley believed the works of piety were important. However, he also said this about this tier of Christian discipleship. He said, "All these means, when divorced from the ends, are less than nothing and vanity. They're an abomination before God. They are a stink in God's nostrils, and God is weary to bear them." What John Wesley is saying there is, if you pray just so you can brag about praying, or if you fast just so you can look like you're a better person than others, Or worse, if you go to a church full of people who are in your same income bracket and who look like you and act like you and watch the same TV shows you have, and you call that a means of grace, Christian friendship, but you're just doing it so that you could be counted as an equal among those people. If you read the Bible just to collect useless information about ancient Palestine and the ancient Roman Empire so that you can win trivia night, and if you eat and drink at the table of the church as if you were someone who belonged to be there and as if you earned that grace of God, then according to John Wesley, you are a stink in God's nostrils. You are an abomination, and God is weary to look at you. Works of piety from John Wesley, who once again was one of the most pious people who've probably ever lived. Works of piety are nothing when divorced from the end of compassion and love. And therefore, John Wesley's next tier are works of mercy. These are things like feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, educating the uneducated, providing medicine for the sick. The entire reason the church exists in Wesleyan theology, and the entire reason we pray and fast and read our Bibles, is so that we can receive grace from God to give to others, so that we can do these awesome works of mercy, which will open up even greater pipes and avenues of grace from the throne room of heaven to us. Once again, we don't do the works of mercy to prove our salvation. We do the works of mercy as a way of understanding that we were hungry and God fed us. We were naked and God clothed us. We were sick and God gave us medicine. We were dumb and God provided an education for us. And so the works of piety are there to serve the works of mercy. And then, if you will commit to the church, perform the works of piety so that you can do these works of mercy. John Wesley believed that you would eventually become what's called an icon or a transcript of the Holy Trinity. That over the course of your lifetime, you would become by grace who God is by nature. That you would be the type of person that when people looked at you, they thought, am I looking at Jesus? That over the course of time, as you stay committed to your local church through thick and thin, as you live a lifestyle marked by prayer and fasting and searching the scriptures and not bragging about it, as you live your life providing education and medicine and food and drink and clothes for the least among us, and as you love and forgive your enemies, then you will eventually become that image, however tainted, of the Holy Trinity, who is love. This is the route of discipleship, and to us Wesleyan Christians, this is what it means to work out our salvation. For it is God who is at work in us to will and to act according to his good purpose, which is love and mercy.